welcome to Interfaith Connections. I am your host, Jackie Fuller. Today, we have an extraordinary woman who's done so much in the interfaith world, and she is definitely a leader in her community as well. And we are happy to have Ruth Broyde Sharone here today with us. She's a filmmaker, author, journalist. She's a creator and producer of Interfaith the Musical, which we'll talk about today. She's also been in the world of interior designing, and she's a mother. How does she do it all? We will find out. Ruth, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for being on the program.
It is my pleasure because I've known you for many years, and I'm so glad you are still doing this. And now is the moment. Now is the moment.
Yes, and I think it's great because what you're doing and having this opportunity to interview you, we'll be able to share this like next level experience together. So I'm really excited to have you, and you look great in your red today.
Thank you.
Now, please, Ruth, because people are curious because I mentioned the various things in the arts you have done. Share with us the background. How have you been doing all these different things, like background information about yourself, and particularly the time to do all these things? So can you share some of that with us?
First of all, I started out as a journalist. I studied in university to become a journalist. And right when I graduated, I spent a year and a half in Latin America. I was in 19 countries in 54 cities. And that was my first real exposure to life outside of my contained small life. I was raised in a Jewish household by a mother who was originally from Riga, Latvia, who spoke 6 languages, who taught Hebrew school, and in a kosher household. And my father he's originally from Russia, and he was raised in the United States. He was very eclectic and cosmopolitan and had a very powerful worldview, was friendly with everybody. And my mother was very, I would say, more frightened of the outside world because of what had happened to Jewish communities in Europe, where she was from. So I had these 2 strains in my life, and I think that they helped make me who I am today, because I have a strong identification with Judaism, and I still go to synagogue on the weekends. Now I'm on the Zoom synagogue, and I'm in Torah study every week with people who I've been meeting with for close to 20 years. So that is the fulcrum and spiritual center of my life. And I don't want to say but, because it's definitely I have a very powerful connection to people of faith, and even people who say they don't have a faith. And why is that? Because everybody is looking for something, some way to understand, give meaning to the world, find a place in the world, find community. And so because of my initial travels in Latin America, and I lived primarily with families, I didn't stay in hotels. So if you can imagine going from country to country, living with all these different families and becoming part of their family, and noticing that even though the culture was different, the music was different, the language was different, but we, in the core, we were all the same. And the aspects of humanity that I had discovered in my own family, the quarrels, how should I say, the challenges that we all face when we're close to other people, that was all there too. And what was really funny sometimes was that because I was a journalist, and those who know me know I am the grand inquisitor, I'm always asking questions, that's sort of one of the things that defines me, is that I would ask, when we're sitting at the evening dinner table with these different families all over Latin America, I would ask the parents questions, and then when they gave the answers, the children would say, "You never told us that." And so they started to discover things about their own parents that they had never asked or even knew to ask. So when I came back, I moved to New York City. I'm originally from Chicago. I moved to New York City, and I started working for the Associated Press. But I had dreams of becoming a foreign correspondent because I had tasted travel, international travel, and it was very appealing to me. And I started studying French in the Alliance Française, and I was getting ready. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but they told me that it would take several years before I could even qualify. So I decided I'm going to just cold turkey. I left. I went to Rome, and I was there for 8 months. I studied Italian, and I worked for the English Chronicle in Rome as a reporter and a photographer. And then I felt moved. I really wanted to go to Israel because I had so many relatives there, and my mother and her sisters and her mother had immigrated from Riga, Latvia to Palestine, where she met my father, and they married in Palestine, and then they came to the United States. And what I found especially titillating to share with my Palestinian and Muslim friends when I lived in Israel for almost 10 years is that my mother had a Palestinian passport because Israel was not yet Israel, right? And so I had a unique look also at the problems of trying to create peaceful coexistence with people who are basically our cousins.
Right. Exactly.
And so I had ideas of how we might move peace further along, but I also saw there were huge stumbling blocks that I knew I couldn't solve alone. And it's more a state of mind,
Yeah.
than just a state of peace. It's a state of mind. And so, but anyway, I was there for almost 10 years, and I worked for the Jerusalem Post as a journalist, and I was an independent freelance director for Israel Television. And I actually was able to make the first color film documentary for television because it was actually called an Israeli fashion tale. And I convinced the head of the television that we should raise money to make it in color because until then, all the films were being made in black and white, and it wasn't on par with what was happening internationally.
Right.
And I went out to the fashion industry and I literally raised all the money to make it in color. And
Wow.
So while I was there, of course, in Israel, and because I visited what's called the West Bank and so forth, and I developed friendships with Palestinians who were both Muslim and Christian, I had in my heart an idea that somehow that if I could bring peace to other parts of the world, and if I could find a way to help the Muslims and Jews, for example, and get along in Los Angeles, United States, that rather than us always being at the affect of what's happening in the Middle East, why can't we be the ones that produce the influence which will get them to live better together? Why does it always have to be that we, all the groups that were established here in the last 20, 30 years, whenever there was a crisis in the Middle East, the groups here would fall apart.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
Except for one group that I am so proud to be part of, and that is called the West Side Cousins Group, which were a group of Muslim and Jewish women that met once a month for 18 years. COVID came, and so we've not been meeting, but we met in each other's homes, and even through the worst circumstances, through the worst conflicts, through the worst enmity that was created because of what was going on in the Middle East, we stayed together. We attended each other's weddings. When someone was sick, we made food for them. When someone in the family died, we went to the funerals. We were throughout all. We were together and we were strong, and we developed such intimacy and closeness that we decided that nothing that was happening in the Middle East could touch us anymore, and that we would find a way to move through it, not around it, but to move through it. And that's what we did. But that's rare. That's rare because so many of the other groups, like, they fell apart. Anyway, so I started I think my first official foray into interfaith happened in 1991. So I got a wild idea, and you'll see some of that in one of the videos that I'm going to be sharing with you called My Love Affair with Interfaith. I got this wild idea to create a Passover Seder that would be interfaith, meaning that I would bring people from other faiths and we would come together, and we wouldn't just go through the Haggadah, the book that tells the story of the Exodus, but there would be music and there would be art projects for children, and that people who were not Jewish would be invited to tell their own personal Exodus story. Because I was realizing that, the story of Passover, the story of liberation from slavery, is a universal story. The Jewish community doesn't have a monopoly on it, but it just so happens that that's part of one of our major holidays. And I found out it is the most celebrated holiday of Judaism, not the Jewish New Year, not Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, but Passover. It's the day when people who have drifted away from the Jewish community find their way back home to be with family, because the rabbis say the table is the altar. And when the Jews didn't have a synagogue to pray at, they created an alternative way of praying to God, and it's through the holidays. And when we eat at the table, when all the symbols, when the food are all symbols of our story of liberation, then the table does become the altar, and then the community is praying together when we recite what happened. And there's a very beautiful injunction in the Torah which says, actually says this in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that every year you must celebrate the Exodus as if you personally are escaping from slavery, not your ancestors, not somewhere in the past, but now at this moment. And so I ended up having 85 people at that Seder. I had to rent a special hall. I had it catered, but it was so well received. People were so excited. And at the end, I had a waiting list of 20 people who couldn't get in. There wasn't enough room. And because I'm a filmmaker, I hired a crew and I had them film it, because I felt this is so special. I need to have a document, a record of it. And Jackie, when I started looking at the footage afterwards and listening to people's stories, I thought, well, there are probably so many stories out there of people that have celebrated Passover, or people that understand this Odyssey, of the Exodus. And so I started looking for people, and literally, I would say, God led me to the most unusual people, including an African-American pastor, Charles C. Queen, who for 4 years had been celebrating Passover with 600 African Americans in Los Angeles. And I happened to meet some of his congregation. They were in the library looking for a film about the afikomen, which is the dessert matzah we have at the end of the ceremony. And I couldn't understand. I thought, well, why would they be asking about the afikomen? And I introduced myself and I said, take me to your leader. And then I ended up filming him, and I filmed Seder for abused wives, and the first feminist Seder in Los Angeles, and a Seder that, that's what the meal is called. The official feast meal ceremony is called Seder. And a Seder for the deaf, and a Seder for alcoholics and recovering alcoholics and drug users, and a Seder at the Catholic workers in Los Angeles. They had been celebrating it for 25 years. And I kept asking, what is there about this holiday that just magnetizes people to come who are not Jewish? And it's because it has this universal theme. And that discovery is what led me to, I would say, 3 decades of interfaith engagement, because finding a universal theme and knowing that everybody resonates to that, then it really didn't matter if what you called God, if you even believed in God, because this is a story about our humanity where we all connect. And when I got that, then I thought, well, so interfaith work has to be done. I know it's done academically. I know there are panels and people coming, and all that is important.
Right.
But maybe there's another way to reach people, not the conventional way, but
Right.
the way through the arts and through even through gastronomic means, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the most the popular activities in the interfaith community is like when women from different faiths get together and bake bread together, right?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
they have ceremonial meals from one faith and then they invite other people who've never attended that. And so, and then of course the arts, music and dance and song, and storytelling. So I worked as the co-chair of the Southern California Parliament of the World's Religions for 10 years. I was one of the co-founders, and we did very unconventional. We held very unconventional events, and um, and then one morning in 2014, I was taking a walk, and I say this. When I share this story, I'm still experiencing a bit of awe myself,
Mhm.
thinking about how it happened, because the truth is, I have high blood pressure, and I was told that I should walk as much as possible. And so I said, okay. And so I invited a friend of mine, Gene Rothman, the late Gene Rothman, unfortunately passed away. I invited him to walk with me. And so for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, we walked together 2, 3 times a week. And it was wonderful. And we discussed politics. And he was in the interfaith community as well. And we had a lot in common. And one day he said, Ruth, I'm really sorry, but I have a friend who needs me more than you do to walk with him. And so I won't be walking with you anymore.
Wow.
So that was a switch. And so I started walking on my own. And that's when the magic began, because when we're alone,
Mhm.
we have a chance to hear God's voice. You can't hear God's voice when you're having rapid ta 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 conversation with someone else and back and forth. I was I was on my own, and suddenly I heard music and words.
Mm.
And the very first words I heard were, "What if when you awoke you were wearing a stranger's shoes?" Huh, that's an interesting thought. What if when you awoke you shared your enemy's extremist views? Oh my God, what would that be like? What if when you awoke you think in color, not black and white? What if when you awoke you could imagine not being right?
Oh.
We all want to be right, right? We can't imagine not being right. And then the chorus came, and then I'm hearing this and I'm singing this out loud, and I'm both singer and audience, right? So I'm listening to this and I'm singing it, not totally understanding what's going on. And then the chorus came, what if, what if we all could see the beauty of one expanding humanity? Expanding humanity. Well, then I wrote the rest of the song, and I came home and I went to my computer and I just wrote down the lyrics, and I remembered the melody. I called some friends and I said, "Hey, I just wrote this song." And they said, "How come?" And I said, "I don't know." And then as the days went by, second song, third song, fifth song, and finally I had about 30 songs. And they were all around the theme of interfaith, all of them. And I shared them with my good friend Yuval Ron, who's a composer, musician, and has written for musicals. And I would sing them to him and his children and his wife, and they would say, and the kids would run around the house singing the songs, chanting the words. And he said, you have a musical there. And I hadn't thought about it until that moment. But when he said it, I something clicked, and I said, that's right, I have a musical. And then the next question was, why? And why
Mm.
me? Right? Because that's not, I'm a writer and a filmmaker, and I love music, and I play the piano, but that was not my métier, and that was not my fantasy. I mean, it was not in my reckoning of how I would be living my life or what I'd be doing. I always thought I'd be continue to make films, and I'd be in the interfaith world, and I was writing. I interviewed so many people for the Interfaith Observer. I wrote more than 50 articles for them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so, but then I thought, well, if I was chosen for this, and that's the question, just like I told you before we started this interview, you were tapped on the shoulder, Jackie, to do what you're doing. And a lot of people can do other things that you've done in your life and that you may be doing at the same time, but no one can do this as well as you. You have been designated. And I thought, why was I designated? It wasn't because I was the best musician in the world, because there's so many talented musicians in the world. It was because I understood the interfaith community. I loved and respected the different faiths, and I knew about them. And I could write about them with facility and with love. I could poke fun, and I could be in admiration, and I could also help people join me in that celebration of our diversity and our magnificence, and also a recognition that it's not easy to live together when you espouse ideas which seem to be contradictory.
Yeah.
But there is so much beauty in the diversity and learning about each other that anybody who has entered this field knows, anybody who has participated comes away with a state of awe about what God has created, or what universe or divinity or spirit or whatever you want to call it, but just the fact of who we are. I say, like, look at the flowers in the field. They're all different varieties. Some prefer the sun, some prefer the shade, some are tall, some are small, some have infinite petals, some have only one bulb. It's like God chose to make us in this way. And when I became familiar with the Quran and through my Muslim friends, they would always quote me this beautiful surah that God says, if I had wanted to, I could have made you all alike, but I intentionally created you to be different so that you would come to know one another. So that's where we are today. And if I wanted to move beyond the kind of interfaith events that I had been orchestrating and helping to support, and if I wanted to move beyond that, I thought it would have to be a way to get to mainstream, right? And mainstream is in the theaters, right? Because people go there to be entertained. They don't go there to be educated. But if you present material in a colorful, exciting, musical, dramatic way, they will listen to it differently than if they go to a lecture about comparative religion, right?
Yeah.
So,
And that's amazing format, because I had a Buddhist friend of mine tell me when he goes to interfaith events, he just said he's not down with the talking heads and he feels like he's in a classroom. So he's one of the types that is either informal or something like what you have to offer, that you're learning, but it's also like a form of entertainment, which is a thing. And sometimes it has that feel of like the audience being more engaged because they're observing and watching the story versus just having someone kind of just, now this is what this religion does and this is what this religion does, versus you feel more engaged and involved in the culture and the atmosphere of the people involved. So that's why I was very fascinated with what you're doing, is it's not that format where it is the talking heads like at a podium or a panel. So it's a really good, way of branching out into doing something different and unique.
well, your friend would love my song, I'm a Buju. I'm a Buju. I'm Buddhist and I'm Jewish. I'm a Buju. Why choose only one when you can choose two? Forget the pros and cons, they're all true. I'm a Buju. I emulate the Buddha and his worldview. I like to meditate and then to argue. I agonize all day, a true Jew. And, when I say that to my friends' children, they ran around the house singing, I'm a butchu. And so I recognized immediately that, when the words are catchy and people can sing them and get pleasure out of them and remember them, then that message will stay with them much longer than if they are approached from an intellectual basis. And so that's when I knew that this became my grand opus, my magnum opus. This is what I'm supposed to do while I'm still here on this earthly plane, COVID or no COVID. Well, COVID has certainly made it challenging for me and many, many people in the performing arts, because we did have a public performance of 8 of the songs
Oh,
in 2019, and May 2019, and the audience was so enthusiastic. They loved it, and all of them stayed afterwards for the Q&A period to find out about how the musical was created and to meet the different singers and the arranger, Casey de Girdas, a very talented young man, that when he worked on the musical with me at the beginning, he, you know, he didn't really know what I was doing. He just knew that I was a friend of his friend who had introduced us, and that I wanted to have songs arranged and create an album. And so he approached it as a very fine and talented musician and arranger. And because at the beginning, then we weren't talking so much about this in that period of time. And we didn't, especially in America, we didn't have the lens to be able to see that the issues of diversity were coming to the fore in such an important, significant way that in a way that challenged the very roots of what does it mean to be American, and who are the Americans, and why are they here, and where did they come from, and who was here first, and all these other things that now are daily topics, but we weren't really talking about it then. So a year after I released the first album, which I'm going to show this to you, this is the blue one,
okay.
Interfaith in Musical, the blue one. Um, he called me a year later and he said, I didn't realize at the time what you were doing, but now I get it. Now I understand that this wasn't just music for music. This wasn't music just to entertain. This was also music for us to become awake and to think about our situation and how we interact with the people around us. So I always like to tell that story, because in a way, when people will come to the theater, they're not going to come because it's about interfaith. They're going to come because they'll have heard that it's a good story. And it does have a great love story in it, and it has lots of conflict and drama and introduction to the cosmology of the Native people. Have 3 strong character roles for Native Americans, which I hope will be played by Native Americans who can sing. And there are plenty of talented people in every community, but that's going to be part of my challenge, is to make sure that the people who are finally on the stage represent who they are, and they're not just taking the role of someone else, but that when we sing, "This is who we are," it'll be because this is who we are.